This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel, and the Israel Institute, enhancing the knowledge and study of modern Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and every week my co-host Dalia Shendlin and I, except this week because she's away, but every week we talk about books and research and other things that have caught her attention. My guest today is a professor of economics at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is the author of a new book entitled The Israeli Economy. It was published recently in Hebrew by Yediot Achronot Press, and it will soon come out in English, will be published by Princeton University Press. The book was recently launched at an event at the Van Leer Institute, and it is a detailed yet highly accessible introduction to all matters Israeli and economic, a sort of everything you wanted to know but were afraid to ask, or is often in our case everything you want to ask but were afraid to know. Professor Joseph Zeira, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Good morning.
So that little quip, everything you wanted to ask but were afraid to know, is something I usually say about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But in the case of the Israeli economy, there's a lot that we're not afraid to know. Quite the contrary. As you write several times throughout the book, the Israeli economy has evolved into a world-class economy on a par with the leading, most powerful and prosperous countries in the world. Now, by way of introduction, can you please tell us what are really the indicators that allow us to think of the Israeli economy in such terms?
I'm looking at the standard indicators, which are GDP per capita, which means the total amount that we produce per person in the country. Sometimes we use an alternative measure, which is GDP per worker, which is how much is produced on average in the country. And in this respect, the Israeli economy is indeed among the most developed countries in the world. I just want to point that I show in the book that we reached this point not today and not in the recent period, but actually around 1972 or 73. So the 50 years of rapid economic growth that Israel went through are the 50 years between 1922 when the Yishuv was started to grow in numbers because it was a very small community then, until around 1972. These are the 50 years of, this is what we call the miracle growth of Israel, although I show in the book that it was not a miracle at all, that it can be fully explained by standard economic arguments.
And also by a historical revision of what happened, predominantly migration and the capital and know-how and other things that it brought along with it.
I don't think that I really disagree with what was published before in economic books. I'm not talking about, books like Startup Nation and stuff like that.
Advocacy.
I'm speaking about the economic research that was published on Israel economic growth. I basically continue it and I add some additional elements into it, but it shows that there are a few basic things that can explain why this happened. And they are related to two main issues. One issue is that the immigrants that came to Israel, unlike many other immigrations around the world, were immigrants who came from the middle class. Jews in Europe were the middle class, not only in Europe, even in the Arab countries. And the middle class usually have more education and has more money than other people. So it wasn't the immigration of the very poor. It was immigration of middle-class people who saw that the surrounding in East Europe until 48 and later in Arab countries has become extremely dangerous for them. And that's why they came. And they brought with them human capital, what we call usually education, and they also brought with them money. Of course, it's important to note that immigrants came with money only until 1948. After 1948, the immigrants that came without a penny. Those were the people who were survivors of the Holocaust, who were refugees in Europe on the one hand, and on the other hand, these were people who had to leave the Arab countries after the War of Independence, after the conflict intensified with the Arab countries, and they were not allowed to take out their wealth with them. So then came a very important government decision in 1952 to sign the reparation agreement with Germany that enabled a flow of finance to the country, that replaced the money of the immigrants. So that decision was crucial for the continuing growth of the economy. So in a sense, when you look at it in a retrospect, the economic growth of Israel was not completely, of course, but to a large extent the result of public government activities. One was the building and the expansion of a wide education system, which was also helped by the fact that a lot of the immigrants had education and they could teach in these schools and institutions.
By wide, you mean public and accessible to all?
Not immediately, but the education expanded very fast. So I show in the book that almost 40%, and even more than that, but at least between 40% and 50% of economic growth was due to expansion of education. This is also shown in another study by Eyal Argov. But also what was needed in order to adopt all the technologies necessary to grow was the availability of financing. And when it was financed by the money of immigrants in the mandatory period, that worked. And then when that couldn't work, the government enabled it by achieving finance from the German reparation money that held almost until the end of the 60s. After that, in the 70s, came the U.S. aid, and that also helped it until the 80s, end of the 80s, where we didn't need it so much anymore.
And another thing that's really interesting, and it has to do probably what you just said about the profile of the migrants in the state years, I mean, in the late 40s and 50s and later in the 1990s, is how the Israeli population, the country absorbed such large numbers of migrants that constituted a huge percentage of the population of the country. Yet, as you show, the upheaval that it caused to the economy petered out very soon. I mean, the economy went back to equilibrium quite fast.
Well, the economy is always get back to equilibrium. And although Israel was hit by very significant shocks of immigration, shocks of war, shocks of other things, but that's one of the things that you can learn from Israel, that the economy usually goes back to equilibrium fast. But we have to remember that this was not just the act of the endogenous process. It was also helped by significant financing that was channeled through the state, whether it was Jewish donations from the U.S. and other countries, but mostly the German reparation money that plays a crucial role in what happened.
So what happened in 1972 if international aid continued in the form of the American aid, yet it was outweighed by other factors?
It's true that we stopped growing fast in 1972, but since then, it's not that we are in shambles. I mean, we continue to grow, but around the same rate of growth of the advanced countries like the U.S. So I'm doing this comparison in the book with the U.S. So it's clear that at some point we had to stop growing so fast. This was just an intermediate period of what I call catching up. The same way as China is now catching up. And China will also stop at some point because you cannot grow faster for a long run than the frontiers of the global economy, than the U.S. So at some point we had to stop. Why it happened in 72 and not earlier or later, that's a big question. And I don't have a clear answer to that. And it's very hard to answer questions that are not, recurrent events. If you have recurrent events, you can analyze it statistically and other things. But it's a one-time event, it's very hard to analyze. I raise a hypothesis in the book that the large wave of immigration of the early days of the state in 48 to 50 took around 20 years. According to all economic studies we know, it takes it kind of 20 years to be integrated into the economy. And these 20 years ended more or less at the early 70s. So that also contributed a lot to the decline in growth in 72.
What about 1967 and the fact that Israel took over the Palestinian territories, complete with several million inhabitants, that required, to an extent, a large expenditure on security issues and actually, administrative issues such as, running these territories. But also, it provided quite a lot of cheap labor. How did these play out?
Okay, 67 it was a crucial year in the history of the Israeli economy, that's for sure. Not for economic growth, but for fiscal policy, for the government budget. And I'll say a few words about it. But I want to, if you allow me, to correct your point.
Okay.
What the big effect of 67 was not necessarily the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. That was important. That was important for many phenomena. But what was important is that we conquered these territories from Jordan, Egypt, and Syria. And the fact that immediately after that we didn't withdraw from the territories but remained in them actually escalated the conflict between us and these states. And this was a very costly conflict. I make in the book a distinction between what I call the narrow conflict and the wide conflict. The narrow conflict is when the conflict is kind of isolated only to between us and the Palestinians. That was the conflict prior to 48, and in a sense, that is the conflict after the peace with Egypt in 1980. But in between, we had a conflict which was wider between Israel and the Arab countries. Now, such a conflict is much more costly in terms of the defense costs, because this is what we call a conventional war. You fight it with jets, you fight it with tanks, you fight it with artillery, you fight it with all kinds of costly ammunition and costly weapons, and also it costs with much more life. So in that sense, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict per se, that kind of, we returned to it in 87 when the first Intifada broke up, and we're actually in that stage now. Because there's no chance for a new Israeli total Arab country conflict without Egypt. I mean, the Arabs cannot arrange a fighting coalition against Israel without Egypt. And as a result, Israel could reduce its military forces significantly. And I've shown it with a study with Michel Stravchinsky that was published like almost 20 years ago in a book by Avi Ben Basat. And we looked at the relationship between the Israeli and Arab countries' military costs, and we saw that after the 80s, there was no correlation between the costs. So Israel didn't view it, in a sense, as a direct threat. But in these years, between 67 and 85, this was still a huge burden on the expenditures. And Israel's costs of the military went up in some years to more than 30% of GDP. That's a huge cost, and it had a significant effect. It had a significant effect on the budget. We went into a huge deficit that in itself caused a huge increase in public debt. Our debt reached a level of 150% of GDP, which is a lot. Just think about it. This is around the debt level of that Greece started its crisis. It also caused inflation, because 1/3 of the deficit was financed by printing money. And inflation went up for a few reasons, and I analyze it in detail in the book.
Yet, as you said earlier, it was just a bump on the road because Israel already had the strong infrastructure of...
It was not a bump on the road.
Okay.
It was very serious. The only way we got out of it is by signing the peace agreement with Egypt, giving up Sinai and getting peace for that. That was the only way. You could see that after that, military costs went down, the debt went down, interest payments were down, and the fiscal crisis was solved. Before that, it didn't work.
So is that why the fact that we've now, since 1987, even before that, since the signing of the peace agreement with Egypt, we've gone back to what you call the narrow conflict, which is much more economically manageable. This is why we're seeing now that despite the ongoing instability in the West Bank and around it and in Gaza, Israel still, the economy is still doing very well? Have we really found a way to separate the two? Because if you look at what politicians on the left and people on the left in general have said, that moving ahead with the peace process, especially vis-a-vis the Palestinians, would allow us the stability and the international recognition and other things that are crucial for economic growth. Has that point been discredited in your view?
I don't want to use this term, and personally I support peace between Israel and Palestine for many reasons.
Including economic ones?
Well, yes, in a sense, but you have to be precise about where. I'll say a few words about it even more, but first let me say that the wide conflict with all the Arab countries had its own military costs, which were huge. But the Israeli-Palestinian conflict also has costs, which are very different. It has much less direct military costs, but it has a cost by increasing the country's vulnerability to recessions. Before the 80s, there were little chance for recessions, because a recession is a situation where the demand for goods, the demand for economic activity is low. This could not happen when you have a huge demand for military expenditures. So there were very few recessions prior to the 80s. After the 80s, the number of recessions increased, and some of them were extremely painful, especially the one during the Second Intifada, because you don't have the huge military demand on the one hand, but you have a significant impact on domestic demands when you have such an outburst of Israeli-Palestinian violence. For example, there are less tourists coming. The intifadas, unlike the standard short wars, takes many years, 6, 4, 5 years, and it doesn't end in a clear way, so it creates a lot of pessimism and it reduces investment. And also it targets the centers of Israeli life. People go less to shopping malls. People go less to places of commerce. And as a result, there is a decline in demand for consumption. So usually whenever there is an intifada, there is also a recession coming with it. The only outlier is the first intifada that started a recession in 89, but then in 90 started the immigration from Soviet Union, and that created enormous demands that pulled the Israeli economy out of the recession. But in 2000, 2004, we had a very severe recession, and so on. So first of all, this is one cost. But there is another cost that is common both to the period of the wide conflict and the low conflict, which is exactly what you said, that there is much more risk in life, in economic life in Israel, due to the possibility of eruptions of violence. And that reduces investment in Israel. And I show in my book that this explains why during the catch-up period, that you remember that we caught up with the developed countries, we did, but we stopped short of fully catching up. We are still something like 30% below the US and most advanced countries. So our GDP per capita or per worker is still lower. This is what is called in the Israeli current discourse, it's called the problem of low productivity of labor. Actually, it's a wrong title, because it's not the productivity of workers. Most of it, I show in my book, 2/3 of it is due to short investment in capital. So investors invest less because they have a higher risk premium. And that can only be, I cannot prove it, of course, but the only candidate that can explain it, the only significant hypothesis can be that this is due to the Israeli-Arab conflict.
So how do you explain the fact that there's really no connection between the low productivity of labor and the propensity for recessions and other things that might blight the economy to a great extent, and the fact that it's still, as you said, according to all the standard indicators, a model economy?
It's an economy that grows well, like other countries, but it can have a much higher level of income, and it doesn't. And that's the cost of the conflict. So we do well, but not well enough. We could do better. But this is something that the public usually doesn't see, because these are not direct costs. These are what economists call alternative costs. If we didn't have a conflict, we could produce more. I can give you another example, which I kind of almost, this one is clear and sharply calculated in the book. And actually, I know that even in the government, people were worried about it. I was invited to meeting with important people in the military and in even the military aid of Netanyahu to discuss this issue. Because what I measured in the book is the cost of conscription in Israel. Because young Israelis do not go directly to universities or to work. They go to the military service, and usually they delay their entry to the job market even further because they go to the famous trip abroad, and they also, sometimes they take courses before the army in order to prepare to the army, and so on and so on. All this makes them go into the job market much later than in other countries, and to accumulate their productivity and human capital much later. They still retire around the age of 65, 67. So it means that on average, during the years, Israelis work less and produce less. And I calculated that in itself can explain a reduction of GDP by 5.7%.
Doesn't it feed into the low productivity of labor?
Sounds
logical.
It can be an explanation to the low productivity of labor, although it's a bit more, you have to fine-tune it, because the productivity of labor is output divided by the number of workers. But this reduces both output and the number of workers. So it's kind of, you might think that it wouldn't change it. It does change it because you're losing the years of high productivity at the end of your career. So it's a bit more delicate argument. But it definitely reduces income. Individuals in Israel are earning less than in other countries, even if they have the same productivity, because they work less years. They earn income less years. They begin their career later, and they end it around the same time.
It sounds like everything that all these factors that you just enumerated are structural ones. The fact that, the conflict exists in many shapes and forms, and it requires certain investments, both financial and in terms of human capital. What is really the role of the government's fiscal policy in navigating all this? Would you say that recent governments, not just Netanyahu's, but overall the way that the Israeli governments of the last several decades have tackled this issue the way they should have?
I don't think that the solution here is fiscal. The solution, and this is somewhere where I voice my own opinion, and not as an economist or not as a researcher of economics. The solution is to change the situation of the Israeli-Arab conflict. Once you have the conflict, you have these costs. You have these outbursts of violence with the Palestinians once in a few years. You have this problem of a high-risk premium that reduces investment, and so on and so on. I mean, these are unavoidable once you have a conflict. The solution is to try to end the conflict. And that is a political solution. Now, I write in the book that there are also potential costs to such a solution. That means evacuation of many settlers from the West Bank. That means giving up territories that a lot of people believe that it belonged to them. That means maybe even a civil war in Israel, like the French had when they evacuated Algiers. This is possible. Any civil war is like the U.S. Civil War. It can be a smaller conflict. But I think that these are costs for the short run. While the other costs of the conflict, the cost in life, the cost in hatred, the cost in deterioration of democracy, and the economic costs, that are annual continuing costs, are long-run costs.
Okay,
and the government needs to make a choice between the short-run costs and the long-run costs.
Let me ask it more specifically to spell it out perhaps better. One of the chapters in your book is about inequality, and the fact that inequality in Israel is second only to the United States in
disposable income.
In disposable income. In a minute, you'll explain exactly what that means. But it seems to me, reading what you said, that it also has to do with the way the government and its budgetary policy tackles inequality. It's not so much the fact that there isn't enough money or there could be more money, but actually what you do with it.
Well, let me say two things here. The government can affect inequality in many ways. Actually, in Israel, it does increase inequality and reduce inequality at the same time, but by different budgets. On the one hand, the educational budgets, by expanding education, and especially in the last 20 years through public colleges that came out throughout the country, it reduces inequality because more and more people have access to education. And I know that a lot of my colleagues in universities look from above about the colleges and the quality of education given them. I think this is hypocrite. I think that even if a graduate of college gets a slightly less good education and earns a little bit less, it's much better than having only high school education. And I think that that definitely reduces inequality. On the other hand, the government, the Israeli government, and it's not only Netanyahu government, it's also the labor governments before, from the mid-80s, early 90s, had a continuing policy of reducing, on the one hand, expenditures and public services, and on the other hand, reducing taxes. They always reduce taxes, and when you reduce taxes, at the end, you have to reduce also services. And that increases inequality, and I explain it in the book easily, but we can also think about it. It increases inequality because people pay less income tax, and income tax is very progressive. It always hurts the rich and benefits the poor. And when you reduce the income tax and reduce the burden of the income tax, you increase inequality. So the government is doing both things. It's reducing inequality through education on the one hand, and it's increasing inequality through continuing policy of tax reduction and what we call budgetary cuts, which is not the policy only in Israel, it's also in other countries, but in Israel it was pretty radical. And as a result, we have a very high Gini coefficient of disposable income. And that's the income after taxes and after subsidies. Now, between me and you, that's the most important income, because that's where what people have at the end of the day in order to go to the store and to buy things. And more importantly, from the economic point of view, that's the income with which they can help educate and raise their children, which matters a lot for the level of inequality in the next generation.
Is that why there has been so much resentment? I mean, I'm thinking about the social movement protests in 2011. And I remember just when they started, Stanley Fischer, who was then the governor of the Bank of Israel, came out and gave his first speech after the protest started. And there were, of course, mass protests with many people from different walks of life in Israel. And he came out and said, he looked slightly puzzled in that press conference and said, well, things haven't really changed that radically. I mean, our indicators are good. It seems like the Israeli economy is doing well. It seemed like he was unable to understand where all these people suddenly came from. And it seems like, from what you're saying, that it's all a question of the disposable income. So maybe we are measuring the economy wrong, that, how it affects the inequality in disposable income is what really affects the way people see the economy, rather than, I don't know, GDP or maybe rates of employment and other indicators.
Look, I don't want to relate to what Stanley Fischer said in that occasion.
It's just an example.
No, because he said it as ex officio, in a sense, due to his job as a governor. But Stanley Fischer, in the 80s, when I was visiting MIT and Harvard as a young postdoc, he explained to me this whole issue of reducing taxes, tax reduction. When we looked at the time at Ronald Reagan, who also cut taxes, and asked him, how come that a conservative economist is reducing taxes and creates a deficit? I mean, this is very unfitting to a conservative economist. And he told me, well, you don't understand, Joseph. It's a political issue. He reduces taxes today in order to create a pressure through the deficit and then to force the Democrats to reduce expenditures, to reduce social services. And I'm sure that Stanley Fischer, who explained that to me, understood very well that that was the policy of Netanyahu as well, to reduce taxes, and he wanted to reduce them even further. And then after the social protest, he stopped it. But he wanted to reduce it further, and then to use the deficit as a whip in order to reduce further social programs and social services. And that is a well-known policy that's called neoliberalism. I don't know what Stanley Fischer thinks about it today. He might have changed. But at the time, when he was a more kind of devoted Democrat, he fully understood it. And actually, he explained it to me. Now, we have to understand that a lot of these things, it takes time to understand. And a lot of the things and the conclusions that I get with respect to the economy that I find and write about it in the book, I didn't understand them a few years back because it takes time to understand things. You know, there is an article I wrote with some other economists about why inflation in Israel jumped in 1983. And we published the paper in 2011. It took us a lot of time to understand it. And still, a lot of people still disagree with us on that. But I think we're right.
What about, do you think that Netanyahu will at some point understand that, as you say, that the state can play a big role in reducing inequality, in bettering all sectors of society by providing more? I mean, education is just one example out of many.
Well, I don't think this is an issue of understanding. It's a political decision, and it depends on ideology. And Netanyahu has a very strict neoliberal ideology. You can say it against him, but you can also say it in his favor. I mean, he's a person with a strong ideology. In that sense, people know what to expect of him. And there is an opposite ideology. If you want, you can go to the kind of classical proponent, is Bernie Sanders today in the U.S., that wants to reduce austerity, that wants to expand public services and raise taxes on the rich, on Wall Street, and so on. Now, the debate between the two camps is not about whether they understand the economy or not. I think both understand very well that this is possible and this is possible. The disagreement is political. And I say it very strongly because it doesn't matter where I belong personally. What is important is that I show in the book, and there is a growing agreement about it among economists as well, that there is no big economic difference between the two different opposite policies. The difference is political, and therefore this is a decision that should be taken by politicians. What I am against is that a lot of politicians tell you the right economy is to cut down government, and that is a travesty of our profession. This is not true. This is not only wrong. This is a misuse of economic theory and economic thinking. And it's a misuse that is done in order to run away from the responsibility of the ideological decision they're making. They want to hide behind the backs of a few economists that say that this is the right policy. So in a sense, people like my dear friend Omer Moav and others that claim that cutting down taxes is the most important thing to do are basically helping politicians to run away from their basic from exposing their ideology and hiding behind some what is called professional advice, which is not professional at all.
Is there such a thing?
No, I don't believe in it. I think that almost every economic decision, except for very few, always hurts one public and benefits another public. And when you make the decision whether you adopt it or not, you have to weigh the two publics and their views. And that's a political thing. That's not a professional thing. And I think that in general, if our job as economists, as economic researchers is to understand the economy, is to learn it, is to study it. We should avoid as much as possible in being involved in the political debates on economic issues, because that hurts our prestige, our good name. It's a big mistake.
All right. On this note, we'll wrap up. Professor Joseph Zeira, an economist at the Hebrew University and the author of this new book, The Israeli Economy. It has come out in Hebrew and will soon come out in English by Princeton University Press. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for the interview.
And many thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shalem and Georgia Foscarini, our producers, and the Van Leer Institute and the Israel Institute for the generous support. And I would like to ask you a little request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. All you have to do is go to the ratings and review section and write us one. You can support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 500 interviews. If you like what we do here, please like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. And follow me and Dalia, who will be back with us next week, on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.